Victoria Hayes adjusted the rearview mirror of her weathered Ford pickup truck as she pulled into the parking lot of Pinnacle Shooting Academy. At 42, she had learned to blend into crowds, to be the woman people's eyes would skip over, without a second thought. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her clothes, faded jeans, worn work boots, and a black t-shirt that had seen better days, spoke of someone who worked with her hands for a living. The shooting range before her was nothing like the public facilities she'd grown accustomed to over the past 15 years. Pinnacle was exclusive, expensive, and catered to a very specific clientele. Located 30 miles outside Washington, D.C., it attracted military contractors, federal agents, and elite law enforcement officers who needed to maintain their edge. The building itself was imposing, concrete and steel construction with reinforced walls and sound dampening that could contain the thunder of high-powered rifles. Victoria sat in her truck for a moment, her fingers drumming against the steering wheel. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the parking lot, and she could see expensive vehicles, Range Rovers, modified pickup trucks, and sleek sedans that screamed government contract money. Her own truck, with its dented tailgate and rust spots, looked woefully out of place. She reached for the worn leather rifle case on the passenger seat, the weight of it familiar in her hands. Inside was a weapon that had been her constant companion. Through some of the darkest chapters of her life, a Vietnam-era M21 sniper rifle that most people would consider a museum piece. The wood stock was scarred and worn smooth by countless hands, and the metal showed the patina of age and hard use. It wasn't pretty, but it had never let her down. The registration desk inside was staffed by a young woman whose nameplate read Jessica. She couldn't have been more than 25, with perfectly applied makeup and polished nails that seemed oddly out of place in this testosterone-heavy environment. When Victoria approached, Jessica looked her up and down with barely concealed skepticism.
"Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place?"
Jessica asked, her voice carrying that particular brand of condescension reserved for people who didn't fit the expected mold. "We cater to professional-level shooters here. The public range is about 15 miles down Route 50. Victoria set her by a rifle case on the marble counter with deliberate care. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said quietly, sliding her membership confirmation across the desk. The document bore the seal of the Department of Defense and several signatures that would have made Jessica's eyes widen if she'd known how to read them properly. Jessica scanned the paperwork with growing confusion. The authorization codes were legitimate, but this woman didn't look like the typical DoD contractor who frequented their facility. Most of them arrived wearing tactical gear and carrying equipment that cost more than her annual salary. "Lane 7 is available," Jessica said, finally handing over a temporary access card. "Just please be careful with our equipment." Victoria nodded and made her way past the gleaming display cases filled with the latest in tactical optics and precision rifles. The main range was a cathedral of firepower, 50 individual lanes stretching out toward targets at distances ranging from 25 to 800 yards. The walls were lined with sound-dampening materials, and the air filtration system hummed quietly to clear the gun smoke that perpetually hung in the atmosphere. It was here that she first saw them. A group of men clustered around lanes 12 through 15, their equipment spread out like a military surplus store had exploded. They wore matching tactical vests emblazoned with the logo of Blackwood Security Solutions, one of the largest private military contractors in the country. Their rifles were works of art, custom-built precision instruments that cost more than most people's annual salary. The group's leader was immediately recognizable to anyone who followed the defense industry. Marcus Blackwood stood 6'4", with the kind of build that suggested he'd never met a weight room he didn't like. His salt and pepper hair was cut in a perfect military fade, and his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of a man who'd made a career out of violence. At 50, he was the CEO and founder of Blackwood Security Solutions, a company that had grown from a small outfit of former Special Forces operators into a billion-dollar empire. Well, Blackwood's voice carried across the range as Victoria set up at lane 7. Looks like someone's grandmother got lost on her way to the knitting circle. His team erupted in laughter. There was Rodriguez, a former Navy SEAL with arms like tree trunks and a personality to match. Thompson, an ex-ranger whose idea of subtle was wearing camouflage in only 3 different patterns. And Miller, a former Marine whose chest was covered in tattoos depicting every conflict zone he'd ever visited. Victoria continued setting up her equipment methodically, unpacking her rifle case as if she hadn't heard a word. What emerged was her M21, and the sight of it drew even more mockery. Jesus Christ, Rodriguez whistled loud enough for the entire range to hear. Is that thing even still functional? My grandfather carried one of those in Nam. Probably shoots about as well as her aim, Thompson added, adjusting the scope on his custom Remington 700 that had more electronic accessories than
A fighter jet. Victoria finally looked up from her preparations, her green eyes meeting Blackwood's stare directly.
There was something in that gaze that made him pause, a depth that suggested she'd seen things that would give most people nightmares. But the moment passed, and his smirk returned. "Ma'am, are you sure you wouldn't be more comfortable at the basic range?" Blackwood asked with mock politeness. "What we're doing here? Well, it's not really suitable for beginners." Victoria's response was quiet, steady, and delivered with the kind of calm that experienced soldiers recognized, but couldn't quite place. "I appreciate the concern, but I think I'll manage." As she spoke, she noticed something that the others had
missed. A small group of other shooters had stopped their own practice to watch the unfolding drama.
Word was already spreading through the range about the middle-aged woman who'd walked into the elite facility with an antique rifle and a confident attitude. The electronic rangemaster's voice crackled over the intercom. All shooters to the firing line. Today's qualification course will be conducted at multiple distances, starting at 100 yards and extending to 600. Each shooter will have 60 rounds to achieve the highest possible score. Best score wins bragging rights and a bottle of bourbon that's older than some of your rifles. Victoria felt a familiar calm settle over her as she approached lane 7. It was the same feeling she'd experienced countless times before, in training, in competition, and in places where the stakes were much higher than bragging rights and expensive whiskey. She had no idea that within the next hour she would shatter every assumption these men had about her, reveal secrets that had been buried for 15 years, and set in motion a chain of events that would bring down one of the most powerful networks of corruption in the defense establishment. All she knew was that after 15 years of hiding, of living under an assumed name and pretending to be someone she wasn't, Victoria Hayes was about to remember exactly who she used to be. And these men were about to learn why the government had spent so much time and effort trying to make sure the world forgot that person had ever existed. The qualification course began at 100 yards, and Blackwood's team took their positions, with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this dance countless times before. Their movements were coordinated like a well-oiled machine, each man settling into his preferred shooting position with equipment that represented the pinnacle of modern firearms technology. Marcus Blackwood himself carried a custom-built rifle that had cost more than most people's cars, a precision instrument with a scope that could identify targets at distances that seemed impossible to the untrained eye. Rodriguez's weapon was equally impressive, modified to his exact specifications. During his years with the SEALs, Thompson and Miller's rifles represented similar investments in lethality and precision. Victoria simply walked to her lane, checked her M21 one final time, and settled into a prone position that seemed effortless despite the concrete floor. Her movements were economical, practiced, but somehow different from the tactical precision displayed by Blackwood's team, where they moved with the aggressive confidence of men who'd been trained to dominate their environment. Victoria moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to become part of it.
"Shooters ready!" came the command. "Fire at will!" The sound was like thunder contained within walls. Blackwood's team fired in rapid succession, their precision rifles barking with authority. Brass casings arced through the air, catching the overhead lights as they tumbled to the concrete floor.
When the smoke cleared, their targets showed exactly what you'd expect from men who made their living with firearms, tight groupings in the X-ring, professional-grade shooting that would have impressed any observer. Then Victoria fired. Her rifle's report was different somehow. Older, deeper, with a sound that seemed to carry more weight than the modern weapons around her. She fired only 3 shots, spaced with the methodical timing of someone who understood that speed meant nothing without accuracy. When the targets were retrieved and scored, a hush fell over the range. Victoria's target showed 3 holes, so close together they could have been covered by a quarter, dead center in the X-ring. But more than that, they formed a perfect triangle, each shot placed with mathematical precision that suggested either incredible luck or skill that bordered on the supernatural. "Lucky shots," Miller muttered, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Marcus Blackwood studied Victoria's target through his binoculars, his expression shifting from amusement to something more cautious. He'd seen a lot of exceptional shooting. In his career, had worked with some of the best marksmen in the world, but there was something about the precision of those 3 shots that didn't sit right with him. The range extended to 200 yards for the second string. This time, the wind had picked up, swirling through the range from the ventilation system and making the flags at each distance dance unpredictably. It was the kind of condition that separated the professionals from the pretenders. Blackwood's team adjusted their scopes, checking wind flags and making calculations with the methodical precision of their training. They fired their strings with practiced competence, achieving scores that would have impressed any observer watching from the gallery. But when Victoria's turn came, she didn't adjust her scope. She didn't check the wind flags or make elaborate calculations. She simply settled into her shooting position, controlled her breathing in a rhythm that seemed almost meditative, and fired 5 shots. When her target came back, the holes were arranged in the shape of a perfect star, all within the 9 ring. The shot group was tight enough to cover with a playing card, and the pattern was so precise it looked deliberate, as if she'd drawn it with instruments rather than created it with bullets. "What the hell?" Thompson breathed, lowering his binoculars. Rodriguez had stopped laughing entirely. He'd seen exceptional marksmanship before, had served with men whose shooting skills were legendary within the special operations community, but what he was witnessing went beyond exceptional. It bordered on impossible. Victoria remained calm throughout, methodically working through her shooting routine as if she were alone on the range. But Blackwood was studying her now with the intensity of a predator who'd suddenly realized that what he'd thought was easy prey might be something else entirely. At 300 yards, the challenge increased significantly. The targets were smaller, and the wind was becoming a serious factor. Any shooter at this level would need to demonstrate not just marksmanship, but a deep understanding of ballistics, environmental conditions, and the subtle art of reading wind patterns. Blackwood himself took the first string, his custom rifle, equipped with a scope that cost more than most people's cars. He was genuinely skilled, and his shots grouped well within the black, the kind of shooting that would have earned respect at any competition in the world. Victoria's approach remained unchanged. She studied the target for perhaps 30 seconds, noting the way the mirage danced in the heat waves rising from the concrete, observing the behavior of the distant flags. Then she fired 7 shots in a rhythm that seemed almost musical, not rushed, but with a cadence that spoke of countless hours of practice ingrained into muscle memory. When the target returned, the range fell completely silent. The holes formed. A perfect smiley face, 2 shots for eyes, positioned precisely in the 10 ring, and a curved line of 5 shots creating a smile across the 8 and 9 rings. It was a demonstration of control so absolute that it bordered on the impossible, a display of skill that went beyond mere marksmanship and entered the realm of artistry. That's not normal shooting, Rodriguez whispered, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. Marcus Blackwood lowered his binoculars slowly, his mind racing. He'd built his career on recognizing talent, on identifying the kind of exceptional individuals who could thrive in the shadowy world of private military contracting. What he was witnessing wasn't just talent, it was mastery at a level that suggested training and experience far beyond anything a civilian could acquire. The crowd around the range had grown. Word had spread through the facility about the woman, who was outshining some of the most elite shooters on the East Coast, and people were abandoning their own practice to witness what was unfolding at Lane 7. Victoria seemed uncomfortable with the attention, her body language shifting subtly to suggest she wanted nothing more than to disappear. But there was steel underneath that modest exterior, something that suggested she was accustomed to being underestimated and had learned to use that assumption to her advantage. As they prepared for the 400-yard phase of the qualification, Blackwood made a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply observing, he would probe, he would push, he would find out exactly who this woman was and why she could shoot like someone who'd spent years in the most elite military units in the world. He had no idea that his curiosity was about to unleash secrets that had been buried for 15 years, or that the quiet woman with the antique rifle was about to prove that some ghosts refuse to stay dead. Part 3. Conflict escalates at 400 yards. Victoria truly began to demonstrate what she was capable of. The targets were barely visible to the naked eye, and the slightest error in judgment would send a bullet wide of the scoring rings entirely. The wind had strengthened, and the flags were now whipping back and forth with genuine force that would challenge even the most experienced marksman. Blackwood's team fired their best strings of the day. These were men who had served in the world's most elite units, who had trained for years to achieve the level of precision they demonstrated. Their targets showed the kind of shooting that would have earned medals in Olympic competition. Tight groups, consistent accuracy, professional-grade marksmanship that represented thousands of hours of training and millions of rounds fired in practice. Victoria approached the firing line for what everyone assumed would be the final demonstration, but something had changed in her demeanor. The casual, almost apologetic manner was gone, replaced by something harder, more focused. She settled into her position with movements that were economical and precise, like a machine designed for this single purpose. The first shot came after nearly 2 minutes of preparation, an eternity in competitive shooting, and the sound seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should have allowed. The second followed 30 seconds later, then the third, fourth, and fifth in rapid succession. 7 shots total, fired with intervals that seemed to follow some internal metronome that only she could hear. When the target was retrieved, Marcus Blackwood actually staggered backward. The holes formed a perfect reproduction of the Delta Force insignia, a triangular arrowhead that was the symbol of America's most elite military unit. But more than that, each shot was placed with such precision that the overall pattern was geometrically perfect, as if it had been drawn with instruments rather than created with bullets fired from 400 yards away. "Who the hell are you?" Blackwood demanded, his composure finally cracking. Victoria stood slowly, checking her rifle's chamber and engaging the safety with movements that were automatic after decades of repetition. She looked at Blackwood with those green eyes that had remained calm throughout the entire demonstration, and for the first time she smiled. "Nobody important," she said quietly. "Just someone who learned to shoot a long time ago." But Blackwood wasn't satisfied with that answer. His mind was racing, trying to place her face, trying to understand what he'd just witnessed. The level of skill she demonstrated wasn't something you picked up at weekend shooting courses or even in most military units. This was the kind of precision that came from the deepest levels of special operations, from units that didn't officially exist, and operations that were never acknowledged. "The Delta pattern," he said, his voice lower now, more controlled. "That's not something you learn from a book." Victoria was already packing her rifle away, disassembling it with the same methodical precision she'd shown in firing it. Lot of people
know about Delta Force these days. Movies, books, internet, information gets around. Not that information, Blackwood pressed. That's the exact specifications of the unit insignia as it appeared on classified documents from 2007 to 2012. I know, because I've seen those documents.
She paused in her packing just for a moment, but it was enough for Blackwood to notice. When she looked up at him again, something had changed in her expression. The mask of casual indifference had slipped just slightly, revealing something harder underneath. "Maybe you're reading too much into a lucky pattern," she said. "Lucky?" Blackwood laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Lady, what you just did isn't luck. What you just did is the kind of shooting that maybe 50 people in the entire world are capable of, and most of them are either dead or working for me." The other shooters on the range had stopped their own practice to watch the confrontation unfold. Word had spread about the woman who had outshot Marcus Blackwood's team, and a small crowd was gathering. Victoria seemed uncomfortable with the attention, her body language shifting to suggest she wanted nothing more than to disappear. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding," she said, shouldering her rifle case. "I was just here to get some practice in." "Practice?" Thompson had found his voice again, though it carried a note of hysteria. "You call creating perfect geometric patterns at 400 yards practice?" Victoria was moving toward the exit now, but Blackwood's voice stopped her cold. "Lieutenant Rachel Morrison," he said quietly, and the name hit Victoria like a physical blow. Her entire body went rigid, and when she turned back to face him, the pretense was gone entirely. For just a moment, everyone in the vicinity saw something that made them unconsciously step backward, a glimpse of the predator that lived beneath the modest exterior. "That name doesn't mean anything to me," she said, but her voice had changed. There was steel in it now and danger. "Rachel Morrison, call sign Ghost," Blackwood continued, his own voice taking on the tone of someone reciting from memory. "Operational Training Group Alpha, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. Deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan between 2008 and 2014. Officially discharged due to medical reasons. Unofficially, well, that's where things get interesting." The range had gone dead quiet now. Even the ventilation system seemed to have paused, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Victoria, Rachel, stood perfectly still, her hand resting on the strap of her rifle case. "You've got me confused with someone else," she said finally. "Do I?" Blackwood smiled, but it was the smile of a predator who had cornered his prey. "Because the Rachel Morrison I'm thinking of was involved in an operation in Syria that went sideways, an operation that resulted in several high-value targets being eliminated but also in some very embarrassing questions being asked about civilian casualties. Questions that certain people in the Pentagon would prefer were never answered. Rachel's hand tightened on the rifle case strap, and for a moment everyone in the vicinity felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "I told you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the range. "You've got the wrong person." But Marcus Blackwood had spent too many years in the intelligence community to miss the signs. The way she held herself, the precision of her movements, the calm that never wavered even under pressure, these were all indicators he'd been trained to recognize. And now he had a name to go with the face. Around them, the crowd was growing larger. Other shooters had abandoned their lanes entirely, drawn by the confrontation between the mysterious woman and one of the most powerful figures in the private military world. Cell phones were appearing, and several people were recording the exchange. Victoria, Rachel, noticed the phones, and something flickered across her face. She'd spent 15 years avoiding attention, staying invisible, making sure that no one would ever connect her current identity with her past. But Marcus Blackwood had just blown that cover in front of dozens of witnesses, and the implications were staggering. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said quietly, her voice carrying a warning that made several people in the crowd take unconscious steps backward. "On the contrary," Blackwood replied, his confidence growing now that he'd identified his quarry. "I know exactly what I'm doing. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" The challenge hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Rachel Morrison, the woman who had spent 15 years living as Victoria Hayes, who had buried her past so deeply that she'd almost begun to believe it herself, stood at a crossroads. She could run as she'd been running for 15 years. She could disappear again, create a new identity, start over in another town with another name, or she could stand and fight, knowing that doing so would expose secrets that powerful people had spent enormous resources to keep buried. As she looked around at the crowd of faces, at the cell phone cameras recording her every move, at Marcus Blackwood's triumphant smile, Rachel Morrison made her choice. The ghost was about to come back to life, and the people who had tried to erase her were about to learn that some secrets are too dangerous to stay buried. "See, that's where you're wrong," Blackwood said, pulling out his phone and scrolling through something with deliberate slowness, "because I've got photos from that."
Operation Satellite Imagery.
And one of those photos shows a female sniper providing overwatch from a position approximately 600 meters from the target building, the same building where you supposedly eliminated 3 high-value targets with headshots at extreme
range. He held up the phone, showing a grainy image that could have been anything to the casual observer. But Rachel's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Her face went pale and her breathing became shallow.
"The problem is," Blackwood continued, his voice gaining momentum like a prosecutor building his case, "the official after-action report says those targets were eliminated by a Hellfire missile from a Predator drone. No mention of any sniper. No
mention of Rachel Morrison. It's like you were never there at all."
"Because I wasn't," Rachel said, but the words lacked conviction now. "Then explain the ballistics evidence," Blackwood pressed, sensing weakness. "Explain the fact that all 3 targets were killed by precision rifle fire, not explosive ordnance. Explain why the Syrian government claimed American snipers were operating in their territory without authorization. Explain why Rachel Morrison's service record was classified at levels that require presidential authorization to access." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Rachel stood frozen, caught between the urge to run and the knowledge that running would only confirm everything Blackwood suspected. Around them, The crowd had grown larger, and she could see the cell phone cameras focused on her like weapons. "You want to know what I think happened?" Blackwood's voice had dropped to a conversational tone now, intimate and threatening at the same time. "I think you were there as part of a black operation that was never supposed to be acknowledged. I think you did exactly what your training qualified you to do, eliminated 3 high-value targets with precision rifle fire. But then something went wrong. Maybe there were civilian casualties. Maybe someone higher up the chain needed a scapegoat. Maybe you saw something you weren't supposed to see." Rachel's jaw clenched and her knuckles were white where they gripped. "The rifle case. So they burned you," Blackwood continued, "erased you from the official record, made it like you were never there. But the problem with ghosts is that sometimes they come back, and when they do, they tend to make quite an impression. The weight of 15 years of hiding, of living a lie, of pretending to be someone she wasn't, suddenly crashed down on Rachel Morrison like a physical force. She had built a life for herself as Victoria Hayes, quiet, unremarkable, invisible. She had a small apartment, a job at a local hardware store, a routine that kept her under the radar. It wasn't much of a life, but it was hers, and it was safe. Now Marcus Blackwood was threatening to destroy all of that with his accusations, and his evidence and his phones full of satellite imagery that could connect her to operations that officially had never happened. "What do you want?" she asked finally, her voice flat and emotionless. Blackwood's smile widened. Nothing complicated, just a conversation about old times, about mutual acquaintances, about opportunities for someone with your particular skill set. "I'm retired." "No such thing in our line of work," Blackwood said. "You know that as well as I do. Skills like yours don't retire, they just go underground for a while." Rachel was already turning toward the exit, but Blackwood's next words stopped her cold.
"Especially when there are people out there who might not want certain facts about Syrian operations becoming public knowledge." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Rachel turned back slowly, and when she looked at Blackwood now, there was
something in her eyes that made several of the onlookers take an unconscious step backward. "Are you threatening me?" she asked quietly. "I'm offering you an opportunity," Blackwood replied smoothly. Blackwood Security Solutions is always looking for operators of exceptional skill. The pay is excellent, the benefits are substantial, and most importantly, we value discretion. The kind of discretion that keeps embarrassing questions from being asked about things that happened in places that don't officially exist. Rachel stared at him for a long moment, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Around them, the crowd had gone completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something that could turn dangerous at any moment. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. It was a sound completely devoid of humor, cold and sharp as winter wind. "You really don't know, do you?" she said. "Know what? Who I am? What really happened in Syria? Why my record was classified?" Rachel's voice was still quiet, but there was something building underneath it, like the rumble of distant thunder. "You think you figured it out, but you're not even close." Blackwood's confidence wavered slightly. "Enlighten me. The operation in Syria," Rachel said, her voice gaining strength now, "wasn't about eliminating high-value targets. It was about covering up the fact that someone in the Pentagon had authorized the sale of advanced weapons to insurgent groups, weapons that were being used to kill American soldiers." The range had gone so quiet that the sound of distant traffic seemed unnaturally loud. "The 3 men I killed," Rachel continued, her voice steady and implacable, "weren't terrorists. They were arms dealers, American arms dealers. And the reason my record was classified wasn't to cover up civilian casualties. It was to cover up the fact that I had documented evidence of weapons trafficking by senior Pentagon officials. Blackwood's face had gone pale. That's impossible, is it? Rachel smiled, and it was a terrible thing to see. Because the man who ordered that mission, the man who told me those arms dealers had to be eliminated to protect American lives, was someone you know quite well. She let the words hang in the air for a moment, watching Blackwood's expression change from confidence to confusion to dawning horror. Deputy Secretary of Defense Jonathan Hartwell, your biggest client. The man who's been channeling contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars to Blackwood Security Solutions. Rachel's voice was gaining momentum now, becoming something fierce and unstoppable. The same man who authorized the weapon sales in the first place. The blood drained from Blackwood's face as the implications hit him. You're lying. Am I? Rachel reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind that could hold hours of audio on a device smaller than a cigarette lighter. Because I still have the recordings of my mission briefings, I still have the serial numbers of the weapons that were being trafficked, and I still have the ballistics reports that prove those weapons were used to kill 12 American soldiers in 3 separate incidents. Blackwood stared at the recorder as if it were a venomous snake. That would be treason. Yes, it would be, Rachel agreed, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, and the penalty for treason is death, which is why Jonathan Hartwell had my record classified and my existence erased from official documentation. He couldn't have me killed outright. Too many people knew I existed. But he could make sure that if I ever tried to come forward, I'd have no official standing to back up my claims. The crowd around them had pressed closer, sensing that they were witnessing something historic, something that would echo far beyond the walls of the shooting range. Cell phone cameras were recording everything, and Rachel knew that within hours, footage of this confrontation would be spreading across social media platforms worldwide. Why are you telling me this? Blackwood's voice was barely a whisper. Because 15 years ago I made a promise to myself, Rachel said, her voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. I promised that someday, when the time was right, I would make sure the truth came out. I would make sure the families of those dead soldiers knew who was really responsible for their deaths. She held up the recorder, and the small device seemed to fill the entire space. This contains enough evidence to bring down not just Hartwell, but everyone who was involved in the weapons trafficking operation, including several current members of Congress, 2 Pentagon officials, and the CEO of one of the largest defense contractors in the world. Marcus Blackwood was backing away now, his face a mask of horror and panic. Around them, the crowd was pressing closer, phones recording every word, every expression, every moment of what was clearly a pivotal confrontation. You can't, he stammered. You wouldn't. Rachel Morrison looked at him with eyes that had seen too much, had carried too many secrets for too many years. She thought of the soldiers who had died because of weapons sold by their own government, of the families who had never learned the truth about their loved ones' deaths, of the 15 years she had spent in exile for trying to do the right thing. Watch me, she said simply. Then she turned and walked toward the exit, her steps steady and purposeful. Behind her, the entire range remained frozen in stunned silence, everyone understanding that they had just witnessed something that would change everything. But just before she reached the door, Rachel paused and looked back over her shoulder. "Oh, and Marcus!" she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the space. "The next time you want to threaten someone, you might want to make sure you actually know who you're dealing with." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving behind a room full of people who had just witnessed the resurrection of a ghost and the beginning of a reckoning that had been 15 years in the making. Outside in the parking lot, Rachel Morrison climbed into her battered pickup truck and sat behind the wheel for a moment, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The confrontation inside had been inevitable. She'd known that someday someone would recognize her, would piece together the fragments of her past. She'd just never expected it to happen so publicly, with so many witnesses and cameras recording every word. She pulled out a phone, not the standard smartphone that Victoria Hayes carried, but a specialized device that wasn't registered to any name in any database. The number she dialed was one she'd memorized 15 years ago and had
never forgotten. "It's Ghost," she said when the call was answered. "The wheels are in motion. Are you ready on your end?"
The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, carrying the kind of authority that came from years of investigative journalism at the highest levels. "We've been ready for 15 years, Rachel. Just give us the word." Rachel looked back at the shooting range where she could see figures moving behind the tinted glass windows. Marcus Blackwood would be making phone calls now, trying to contain the damage, reaching out to his connections in the Pentagon and the intelligence community. But it was already too late for damage control. "The word is given," she said. "Operation Reckoning is now active." She ended the call and started the truck, pulling out of the parking lot with the deliberate care of someone who knew they were about to become the most hunted person in America. But Rachel Morrison had been hunted before by people far more dangerous than Marcus Blackwood and his corporate mercenaries. This time, however, she wasn't running. This time, she was hunting back. As she drove through the Virginia countryside, Rachel's mind was already working through the steps that would
follow.
Within hours, major news organizations around the world would receive copies of everything she had: audio recordings, financial documents, ballistics reports, satellite imagery, classified communications. The story would break simultaneously across multiple platforms, making it impossible for anyone to suppress or spin. But the real beauty of her plan wasn't just the evidence she'd accumulated over 15 years of careful preparation. It was the way Marcus Blackwood's arrogance had just provided her with the perfect catalyst. His public confrontation, recorded by dozens of cell phone cameras, would serve as the opening act for a much larger drama. 3 hours later, in a secure conference room deep within the Pentagon, Deputy Secretary of Defense Jonathan Hartwell received a phone call that made his
blood run cold.
The voice on the other end was one he had hoped never to hear again, speaking words that confirmed his worst nightmare. "Hello, Jonathan," Rachel Morrison said, her voice carrying clearly through the encrypted line. "We need to talk." The secure facility where Rachel had arranged to meet Hartwell was a far cry from the gleaming Pentagon offices where he normally conducted his business. Located in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Baltimore, it was the kind of place where inconvenient conversations could be held without the risk of surveillance or interruption. Rachel arrived first, as she always did. Old habits from her operational days died hard, and she had learned long ago that controlling the environment was often more important than controlling the conversation. She positioned herself where she could see all the entrances with multiple exit routes planned and memorized. The weight of her sidearm under her jacket was a familiar comfort, though she hoped she wouldn't need it tonight. Hartwell arrived, exactly on time, which told Rachel that despite his current position, he hadn't completely forgotten his military training. He came alone as instructed, though she was certain there were backup teams positioned throughout the area. She had expected
as much. "Rachel," he said, as he entered the warehouse, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and apprehension. "I was beginning to think you were dead." "Sometimes I wished I was," she replied, not moving from her position in the shadows. "It would have been easier than living with what I know." Hartwell was older than she remembered, his dark hair now streaked
with grey and his face lined with the stress of high office. But his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless when necessary. "We don't have to do this, you know," he said, stepping deeper into the warehouse. "Whatever problems we had 15 years ago, we can work them out. You were always one of my best operators, Rachel. There's still a place for you in the new paradigm." "The new paradigm?" Rachel laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is that what you call selling weapons to insurgents? Is that what you call getting American soldiers killed for profit?" "The world is more complicated than you understand," Hartwell said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that had always made Rachel's teeth clench. "Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good. Sometimes sacrifices are necessary to maintain the balance of power." 12 soldiers died because of those weapons, Rachel said, stepping out of the shadows so he could see her face clearly. 12 men and women who trusted their government to protect them, who trusted people like you to make sure they had the best equipment and intelligence available. Instead, you sold them out for money. "It wasn't about money," Hartwell protested. "It was about maintaining our intelligence network in the region. Those weapons were being tracked, Rachel. Every serial number, every transaction was monitored. We were gathering intelligence on the entire network of insurgent fighters and their supporters." "Really?" Rachel pulled out the digital recorder she had shown Blackwood earlier. "Because that's not what you said in your briefings to me. Would you like me to play them for you? Would you like to hear yourself explaining how much profit the Pentagon was making from those weapon sales?" Hartwell's face went pale, but he recovered quickly. "Even if what you say is true, it doesn't matter now. That was 15 years ago. The statute of limitations has expired. The people involved have moved on. The world has changed. Has it?" Rachel asked. "Because from what I can tell, the same patterns are still playing out. Different wars, different weapons, but the same people getting rich while soldiers die. The only thing that's changed is the scale." She gestured toward the recorder. "This doesn't just contain evidence about the Syrian operation. It contains documentation of ongoing weapons trafficking, current financial arrangements, and recorded conversations with people who are still very much active in the defense establishment." Hartwell's composure finally cracked. "What do you want? Rachel? Money? Position? A guarantee of immunity?" "Name your price." "I want justice," Rachel said simply. "I want the families of those dead soldiers to know the truth.
"I want the American people to understand what their government has been doing in their name, and I want the people responsible to face the consequences of their actions. That's impossible, and you know it," Hartwell said, desperation creeping into his voice. "The implications would be catastrophic. It would undermine confidence in the entire defense establishment. It would damage our relationships with allies. It would hold people accountable for their crimes," Rachel interrupted. "And that's exactly what's going to happen." She pulled out a second device, a small satellite communicator that connected directly to secure servers maintained by investigative journalists around the world. "In exactly 12 hours, she said, every major news organization in the world is going to receive copies of everything I have. Audio recordings, financial documents, ballistics reports, satellite imagery, classified communications. Everything." Hartwell stared at the device in horror. "You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life," Rachel replied. 15 years ago, you thought you could erase me, make me disappear, pretend I never existed. But ghosts have a way of coming back, Jonathan. And when they do, they tend to bring the truth with them. "This will destroy you too," Hartwell said desperately. "You were part of those operations. You pulled those triggers. When this comes out, you'll be branded as a traitor, a terrorist,
They'll hunt you down and kill you." "Maybe," Rachel agreed. "But at least the truth will be out there. At least the families of those soldiers will know who was really responsible for their deaths. And at least future soldiers might be protected from people like you." She started walking toward the exit, but Hartwell's voice stopped her. "What about Blackwood?" he asked. "He knows who you are now. He'll come after you." Rachel paused and looked back at him. "Marcus Blackwood is the least of my worries. He's a corporate mercenary playing at being a soldier. I've dealt with much more dangerous people than him. He has resources, Rachel, connections, people who owe him favors." "So do I," Rachel said quietly. "The difference is that my people actually serve their country instead of just profiting from its wars." She walked to the exit, then paused one more time. "Oh, and Jonathan, when you're trying to figure out how to spin this story, remember that I still have contacts in every major news organization in the world. People who remember what real journalism looks like. People who understand the difference between reporting the truth and repeating government propaganda." The warehouse door closed behind her with a finality that echoed through the empty space. Jonathan Hartwell stood alone in the darkness, his career, his reputation, and his freedom crumbling around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. Outside, Rachel Morrison climbed back into her truck and drove into the night, knowing that by tomorrow the world would be a very different place. The ghost was finally ready to tell her story, and the people who had tried to erase her were about to learn that some secrets are too important to stay buried. The next morning, Marcus Blackwood sat in his office watching the news unfold like a slow-motion catastrophe. Every major network was running the same story. Pentagon official, implicated in weapons trafficking scandal. The documentation that Rachel Morrison had promised to release was already making its way through newsrooms across the globe, and the initial reports were devastating. His phone had been ringing non-stop since 5 a.m., with clients, investors, and government contacts all demanding explanations he couldn't provide. The stock price of Blackwood Security Solutions had already dropped 30% in pre-market trading, and congressional leaders were calling for immediate investigations. "Sir," his assistant's voice came through the intercom, "there's someone here to see you. She says it's about yesterday's incident at the range." Blackwood looked up from the financial reports scattered across his desk, his face haggard from a sleepless night. "Send her in." The woman who entered wasn't Rachel Morrison, but someone he didn't recognize at all. Athletic, brunette, in her 30s, wearing a crisp business suit and carrying a briefcase that looked expensive enough to buy a car. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, extending her hand, "my name is Amanda Davis. I'm an investigative journalist with the Washington Herald. I believe we need to talk." Blackwood's blood ran cold. "I'm not giving any interviews." "About your threats against Rachel Morrison yesterday?" Davis interrupted smoothly. "About your knowledge of classified operations in Syria? About your company's contracts with Deputy Secretary Hartwell?" "I'm afraid this isn't really a request, Mr. Blackwood." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "You see, Miss Morrison wasn't the only person recording conversations yesterday. The Pinnacle Shooting Academy has quite sophisticated surveillance systems, and several of your own employees were live-streaming parts of the demonstration to social media." Blackwood's hands began to shake as Davis spread photographs across his desk, images of him confronting Rachel, close-ups of his face as he made his threats, time-stamped screenshots of his team's social media posts bragging about their skills before the demonstration began. "The internet is forever, Mr. Blackwood," Davis continued conversationally, "and when a story breaks involving government corruption and weapons trafficking, people start looking very carefully at everyone connected to the principals. Your company's name appears in the documents Miss Morrison released. A lot. That doesn't
Prove anything, Blackwood said desperately. Contracts with the Pentagon are public record.
Every defense contractor has contracts specifically tied to operations that supposedly never happened? Davis raised an eyebrow. Detailed knowledge of classified personnel records? Executives who threatened former special operations soldiers in public? She pulled out her phone and showed him a video that was already trending on multiple social media platforms. It was footage from the shooting range showing Rachel's impossible demonstration, followed by Blackwood's increasingly desperate attempts to threaten and intimidate her. This video has been viewed over 2 million times since yesterday evening, Davis said. The comments are illuminating. It seems a lot of people recognize exceptional marksmanship when they see it, and they're very interested in finding out why. Someone with those skills would be living under an assumed name. Blackwood slumped in his chair, the weight of his situation finally crushing down on him. "What do you want?" "The truth," Davis said simply. "About your relationship with Hartwell. About the contracts your company has been awarded. About what you knew regarding weapons trafficking operations. About why you thought threatening Rachel Morrison was a good idea. And if I don't cooperate?" Davis smiled, and it was surprisingly warm despite the circumstances. "Then I write the story based on the evidence I already have, which frankly doesn't paint you in a very favorable light. But if you do cooperate, if you help me understand the full scope of what's been happening, then maybe we can frame this as a story about someone who was deceived by their government contacts rather than someone who was an active participant in criminal activities." Blackwood stared at the photographs on his desk, seeing his career and his company crumbling before his eyes. Outside his office windows, he could see protesters already gathering, holding signs demanding accountability and justice for the soldiers who had died. "She planned this," he said quietly. "Morrison. She planned all of it. The shooting demonstration, the confrontation, everything. She knew exactly what would happen when she walked into that range." "Yes, she did," Davis agreed. "And it was brilliant. A single demonstration of skill that would force you to reveal your hand, followed by the systematic release of evidence that would bring down an entire network of corruption. It's the kind of strategic thinking you'd expect from someone trained in special operations." "So what happens now?" Blackwood asked. Davis closed her briefcase and stood up. "Now you decide whether you want to be remembered as part of the problem or part of the solution. The truth is coming out either way, Mr. Blackwood. The only question is whether you'll be standing with it or trying to hide from it." As she walked toward the door, Davis paused and looked back. "Oh, and Mr. Blackwood? You might want to watch the news this afternoon. Miss Morrison is giving her first public interview since the story broke. Something tells me it's going to be quite enlightening." Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the fallout was spreading like wildfire through the corridors of power. Congressional leaders were demanding hearings, Pentagon officials were scrambling to contain the damage, and the president's press secretary was fielding questions that had no good answers. Deputy Secretary Hartwell had barricaded himself in his office, refusing to take calls from reporters and watching his career implode in real time. The evidence Rachel had released was comprehensive and damning. Audio recordings of briefings where he discussed profit margins from weapon sales, financial documents showing money flowing through offshore accounts, ballistics reports proving that American weapons had killed American soldiers. But the most devastating piece of evidence was a video recording Rachel had made during one of their final meetings 15 years ago. In it, Hartwell could be seen and heard explicitly discussing the need to eliminate the arms dealers, not because they were terrorists, but because they were about to expose the Pentagon's involvement in the trafficking operation. "We can't let them talk," his recorded voice said clearly. "Too many people would ask too many questions. The mission has to look like a counter-terrorism operation. Clean, surgical, no survivors who can contradict the official story. The recording was playing on every news channel in the country, and social media was exploding with demands for Hartwell's immediate arrest. Hashtags like Justice for Our Troops and Basham Pentagon scandal were trending worldwide, and the story was dominating headlines from London to Tokyo. In her small apartment across town, Rachel Morrison sat watching the coverage with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. For 15 years, she had carried the weight of this secret, had lived with the knowledge that the soldiers who died because of those weapons would never receive justice. Now, finally, the truth was coming out. Her phone rang. The
regular one, not the encrypted device she'd used for operational communications.
The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice was familiar. "Miss Morrison, this is Colonel James Bradley, retired. I served with Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, one of the soldiers killed by those
weapons in Afghanistan." Rachel's breath caught in her throat.
She remembered Torres from the casualty reports, 24 years old, married, with a daughter he'd never see grow up. "I wanted to thank you," Bradley continued, his voice thick with emotion, "for what you're doing, for making sure people know the truth about what happened to Mike and the others, their families. They've been waiting 15 years for answers." Similar calls came throughout the day, from military families, from veterans, from soldiers who were still serving and wanted to express their gratitude that someone had finally stood up for the people who couldn't speak for themselves. The ghost was no longer hiding in the shadows. Rachel Morrison had stepped into the light, and with her had come the truth that powerful people had spent 15 years and countless resources trying to bury. The reckoning had begun, and there would be no stopping it now. The hearing room in the Hart Senate office building had never seen anything quite like it. Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, gavelled the emergency session to order as cameras from every major news network in the world focused on the witness table where Rachel Morrison sat alone, facing a panel of senators who would determine whether the most explosive military scandal in decades would lead to criminal prosecutions. Rachel had traded her worn jeans and work boots for a simple black suit that somehow made her look both professional and
formidable.
The thin scar that ran from her temple to her jawline was clearly visible under the harsh committee room lighting, a reminder of battles fought in places that didn't appear on any official maps. "Miss Morrison," Senator Williams began, her voice carrying across the packed chamber, "you understand that you are testifying under oath today, and that perjury before this committee is a federal crime." "I understand completely, Senator," Rachel replied, her voice steady and clear. "I've been waiting 15 years to tell this story under oath." In the gallery behind her, the families of the 12 soldiers killed by the trafficked weapons sat in the front row. She had met with each of them the night before, had looked into the eyes of mothers and fathers, wives and children who had never known why their loved ones had died. Now, finally, they would have answers. At a table to her left sat Marcus Blackwood, flanked by 3 high-priced defense attorneys who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. The past week had been devastating for the CEO of Blackwood Security Solutions. His company's stock had become worthless, federal prosecutors were circling like sharks, and former clients were distancing themselves so fast it created its own wind current. But it was the empty chair at the witness table that drew everyone's attention. Deputy Secretary of Defense Jonathan Hartwell had been scheduled to testify, but his attorneys had announced that morning that he would be invoking his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The man who had orchestrated the weapons trafficking operation was hiding behind constitutional protections, while the woman he'd tried to erase sat ready to face any question Congress could ask. "Miss Morrison," Senator Williams continued, "in your own words, please tell this committee what happened during Operation Silent Thunder in Syria 15 years ago." Rachel leaned forward slightly, her green eyes scanning the faces of the senators, before settling on the cameras that would carry her words to millions of viewers around the world. "Operation Silent Thunder was sold to me as a counter-terrorism mission," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through hell and emerged with the truth intact. "I was told that 3 high-value targets were planning
an attack on American forces and that they needed to be eliminated before they could carry out their plans." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the chamber. "What I discovered during the mission was that these men weren't
terrorists. They were arms dealers, American citizens who had been selling weapons to insurgent groups with the full knowledge and approval of Deputy Secretary Hartwell and other Pentagon officials. They weren't planning an attack on our forces, they were planning to expose the weapons trafficking operation." The committee room erupted in murmurs and whispers despite Senator Williams's calls for order. Rachel continued, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Deputy Secretary Hartwell ordered their elimination, not to protect American soldiers, but to protect American officials who were making millions of dollars in profit from weapons sales that were getting our own people killed." Senator James Crawford, the ranking Republican on the committee, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. "Miss Morrison, these are extremely serious allegations. What proof do you have beyond your own testimony?" Rachel reached into her briefcase and withdrew the digital recorder that had become the most famous piece of evidence in Washington. "I have recordings of every briefing I received regarding Operation Silent Thunder, Senator. Would you like me to play Deputy Secretary Hartwell's voice explaining how much money the Pentagon was making from these weapon sales?" Without waiting for an answer, she pressed play. Hartwell's voice filled the chamber, clear and unmistakable. "The beauty of this operation is that we're being paid twice, once by the insurgents for the weapons, and again by Congress for the contracts to fight them. It's the perfect business model, and these arms dealers are threatening to destroy it." The silence that followed was deafening. In the gallery, several family members of dead soldiers began to weep openly. On the committee panel, even the most hardened politicians looked shocked by the casual callousness in Hartwell's recorded voice. "Senator Crawford," Rachel said quietly, "I have 17 hours of recordings like that one. I have financial documents showing money flows through offshore accounts. I have ballistics reports proving that weapons sold through this operation killed 12 American soldiers. I have satellite imagery, mission reports, and sworn statements from other operators who were told to stay silent." She gestured toward the gallery. "But more importantly, I have the faces of the families who were never told why their loved ones really died. They were told their sons and daughters and husbands were killed by terrorists using foreign weapons. They were never told that the weapons were American-made, sold by American officials for American profit." Marcus Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Rachel's gaze swept over him. "Mr. Blackwood's company was one of the primary beneficiaries of this arrangement," she continued. "Blackwood Security Solutions received over $200 million in contracts related to operations in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Operations that were designed not to win wars, but to sustain them. Wars are only profitable if they continue, after all." Blackwood's lead attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but the CEO looked like a man who had already accepted his fate. Senator Williams leaned forward. "Miss Morrison, if you had this evidence 15 years ago, why didn't you come forward then?" Rachel's expression hardened. "I tried, Senator. I reported my findings through proper channels. I requested meetings with the Inspector General's office. I followed every protocol in the book." She paused, her voice carrying the weight of 15 years of frustration and anger. The response was to classify my service record at levels that required presidential authorization, erase all documentation of my existence from official files, and force me into early retirement with a medical discharge that was a complete fabrication. In essence, Senator Williams said slowly, the Pentagon attempted to erase you from history. They succeeded, Rachel replied. For 15 years I lived under an assumed name, in constant fear that someone would recognize me and finish what they started. I watched as the same patterns continued. Different wars, different weapons, but the same people getting rich while soldiers died. She stood up slowly, her hand resting on the stack of evidence beside her. But some truths are too important to stay buried, Senator, and some promises are too sacred to break. I promised myself that someday I would make sure the families of those 12 soldiers knew who was really responsible for their deaths. Today, I'm keeping that promise. The chamber erupted in applause from the gallery, despite the senator's gavels and calls for order. The families of the dead soldiers were on their feet, some crying, some cheering, all finally hearing the truth they had been denied for 15 years. When order was finally restored, Senator Williams looked directly into the cameras. Based on the evidence presented here today, this committee will be recommending immediate criminal referrals to the Department of Justice. We will also be launching a comprehensive investigation into the Pentagon's procurement processes and oversight mechanisms. She turned to Rachel, her voice softening slightly. Miss Morrison, this committee and this nation owes you a debt of gratitude for your courage in coming forward. The truth you've brought to light today will undoubtedly save countless lives in the future. As the hearing adjourned and the crowds began to file out, Rachel remained seated at the witness table for a moment, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd been carrying for 15 years. The ghost was finally at rest, and the truth was finally free. Marcus Blackwood approached her table as his attorneys packed up their files. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I'm sorry. I had no idea how deep this went." Rachel looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much, but had never lost their capacity for forgiveness. "You know now," she said simply. "The question is what you do with that knowledge." As she walked out of the Hart Building into the afternoon, sunlight, Rachel Morrison, no longer hiding behind the name Victoria Hayes, felt truly free for the first time in 15 years. The reckoning was complete, and justice was finally within reach. 6 months after the Senate hearings, Rachel Morrison stood at the gates of Arlington National Cemetery, holding a small bouquet of white roses. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn light that made the marble headstones gleam like beacons across the rolling hills of the nation's most sacred ground. She walked slowly through Section 60, where the newest graves held the remains of soldiers killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. The names carved into the white marble told stories of lives cut short, of promises unfulfilled, of families forever changed by war. But today, those families, finally, had answers. At grave marker 453218, Rachel knelt and placed 3 roses at the base of the headstone. The name etched in the marble read, "Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, age 24, beloved husband."
"And father?"
Below it was carved, "He gave his life for his country." A small American flag fluttered in the morning breeze beside a photograph of a young man in dress blues, smiling broadly next to a woman holding a baby girl. "I'm sorry it took so long, Mike," Rachel whispered, her fingers tracing the carved letters of his name. "But your daughter knows the truth now. They all know. Similar scenes were playing out across the country as families visited the graves of the 12 soldiers who had been killed by the weapons sold through Jonathan Hartwell's trafficking operation. For 15 years, these families had lived with the official story that their loved ones had died fighting terrorists armed with foreign weapons. Now they knew that their sons and daughters and husbands had been betrayed by the very system they had sworn to defend. The trials had been swift and decisive. Jonathan Hartwell, facing overwhelming evidence and with no political cover remaining, had pled guilty to treason, conspiracy, and weapons trafficking. He was now serving 3 consecutive life sentences in the federal Supermax prison in Colorado, his name forever synonymous with betrayal and corruption. Marcus Blackwood had fared better, his cooperation with prosecutors earning him a reduced sentence of 15 years for conspiracy and fraud. Blackwood Security Solutions had been dissolved, its assets liquidated to pay restitution to the families of the soldiers who had died. The CEO, who had once commanded a billion-dollar empire, now spent his days in a minimum security federal facility, teaching other inmates basic computer skills. But the most significant changes had come within the Pentagon itself. A complete overhaul of weapons procurement and oversight procedures had been implemented, with independent inspectors general offices established to monitor all defense contracts. The Hartwell Protocols, as they came to be known, required multiple levels of authorization and oversight for any weapons sales to foreign entities, making it virtually impossible for a single official to orchestrate the kind of trafficking operation that had cost so many lives. Rachel had been officially reinstated to her former rank and offered a position as a special advisor to the Secretary of Defense on procurement oversight. She had politely declined. After 15 years of hiding, she had no desire to return to the corridors of power where corruption could so easily take root. Instead, she had used her newfound public platform to establish the Torres Foundation, named after the young sergeant whose grave she now visited. The foundation provided support and advocacy for military families, with a particular focus on ensuring transparency in how their loved ones had died and holding accountable those responsible for unnecessary casualties. The foundation's headquarters were located in a modest office building in downtown D.C., just a few blocks from the Pentagon. Rachel often walked past the massive building on her way to work, remembering the woman she had once been, the ghost who had carried out impossible missions in the shadows, who had believed that serving her country meant following orders without question. Now she understood that true service sometimes meant standing up to the very institution you served, that real patriotism required holding leaders accountable when they betrayed the trust placed in them. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel James Bradley, the retired officer who had called her on that first day when the story broke. His message was simple. Torres's daughter just graduated from West Point, top of her class. She wants to meet you. Rachel smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Maria Torres was now 20 years old, the same age her father had been when he enlisted. She had grown up hearing stories about the father she'd never really known, and now she was following in his footsteps, but with the knowledge and oversight that would keep her safer than he had been. The meeting was scheduled for that afternoon at the Foundation offices. Maria Torres arrived precisely on time, wearing her dress grey uniform with the gold bars of a second lieutenant gleaming on her shoulders. She was beautiful in the way her father had been handsome, clear eyes, strong jawline, and an bearing that spoke of confidence earned through hard work and determination. "Miss Morrison," she said, extending her hand with military precision. "Lieutenant Torres, I wanted to thank you for what you did for my father and for all the others." Rachel took the young woman's hand, feeling the strength and purpose in her.
Grip. Your father was a hero, Lieutenant. He died believing he was protecting his country. And in the end, that's exactly what he did. His death, and the truth about it, will protect countless other soldiers.
They sat in Rachel's office, surrounded by framed photographs of the 12 soldiers whose deaths had exposed the trafficking operation. Maria looked at each photo carefully, reading the names and ages, understanding that her father was part
of something larger than any individual tragedy. "I'm going to be a military intelligence officer," Maria said. "I want to make sure that what happened to my father never happens to anyone else." "That's exactly what he would have wanted," Rachel replied.
Your father believed in accountability, in doing the right thing even when it was difficult. Those beliefs live on in you. As the afternoon wore on, they talked about the changes that had been implemented since the scandal broke, about the new oversight mechanisms and transparency requirements. Maria was particularly interested in the technical aspects of weapons tracking and financial auditing, the nuts and bolts of preventing corruption before it could take root. "You know," Maria said as their meeting was ending, "when I was little, I used to dream about meeting the person who found out the truth about my father's death. I imagined some kind of superhero, someone larger than life who could see through lies and fight injustice with supernatural powers." Rachel laughed softly. "And instead, you got a middle-aged woman with grey hair and a lot of baggage." "No," Maria said seriously. "I got someone who understood that real heroism isn't about superpowers or perfect aim, though yours is pretty amazing. It's about refusing to let the truth stay buried, no matter how powerful the people trying to bury it are." As Maria left the office, Rachel stood at her window watching the young lieutenant walk down the street with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly where she was going and why. The circle was closing. The daughter of a man killed by corruption would spend her career fighting to prevent others from suffering the same fate. That evening, Rachel returned to her small apartment for the first time, feeling truly at peace. The walls were lined with letters from military families, photos from the Congressional hearings, and framed newspaper articles documenting the fall of one of the most extensive corruption networks in Pentagon history. But the item she treasured most was a simple handwritten note from the mother of Sergeant First Class Michael Torres. "Thank you for giving us our son back. We know now that he died with honor, serving the country he loved. That knowledge means everything to us." Rachel Morrison, no longer hiding behind an assumed name, no longer living as a ghost, settled into her favorite chair and opened a book. Outside her window, the lights of Washington, D.C. twinkled like stars, and somewhere in those lights were the offices where new policies and procedures were ensuring that future soldiers would be protected by the truth that she had fought so
hard to reveal.
The shooting range demonstration that had started it all seemed like a lifetime ago. Marcus Blackwood's mockery, his threats, his attempt to intimidate her into silence, all of it had backfired spectacularly, providing the perfect catalyst for a reckoning that had been 15 years in the making. The ghost had returned, and with her had come justice for the 12 soldiers who had died for other men's profits. Their families finally had the truth they deserved, and their deaths had meaning beyond the tragedy that had created. Rachel Morrison closed her book and smiled, finally understanding that sometimes the most important shots aren't the ones fired at distant targets, but the ones aimed directly at the heart of truth itself. And just like all of her shots, this one had found its mark with perfect, devastating precision. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.